Hello and welcome to Season 5, Episode 11 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Christina Hagen, coming to you live from Cape Town. We have well over 150 episodes recorded and available on YouTube, so if you miss out because of load shedding or your Tuesday nights have become busy, never fear, you can always catch up later. We are on all major social media channels, and you can use the hashtag Conservation Conversations to let us know what you think of the show. We aim to keep these webinars free for all to learn and enjoy. So if you do enjoy the series and can contribute, no matter how small an amount, please do consider donating. As I've mentioned, we have moved away from Quicket as our donation platform, and you can now donate directly through the BirdLife South Africa webpage. You can either go to the link on the screen or scan the code, and it will take you directly to the website. You can also do an EFT to BirdLife South Africa and use the webinars and your name as a reference. And we're so grateful to those of you who do continue to support us. And now we are again running a donation competition with the amazing Ultimate Companion to Birding in Southern Africa as the prize, courtesy of Peter and Irene Ginn. If you donate at least 100 Rand, you'll be entered into a draw for one of these books. And each multiple of 100 Rand that you donate gets you another entry. And the prize is only open to South African residents, unfortunately, due to the costs of postage. But please do get those donations in before the end of July, and you will stand a chance to win one of these amazing books. But on to tonight's talk. We're heading to Marion Island with Dr. Anton Wolfaardt to hear about the Mouse-Free Marion Project, which is aiming to eradicate mice from this amazing island. So Anton has worked in the field of seabird and marine conservation for almost 30 years. And he started his journey on Marion Island, appropriately enough, in 1994, where he spent a year working as a seabird field researcher. He subsequently spent 5 years on Dussin Island, where he did his research for his PhD, among other things. And he then worked as a regional ecologist for Cape Nature, which is the conservation authority in the Western Cape. He has lived on the Falkland Islands as well, and was working for the agreement on the conservation of albatrosses and petrels as the coordinator for the UK South Atlantic Overseas Territories. He returned to South Africa in 2013 and continued with the working with ACAP. And in 2021, he was appointed as the Mouse-Free Marion Project Manager. So Anton, we are very happy to have you on the show. And I do just want to mention that Anton's Mouse-Free Marion Project colleagues, Keith Springer and Sue Tonin, have also joined us as panelists, and they will help answering some questions at the end. So Anton, if you would like to start sharing your screen and switch on your video, that would be great, and you can get going.
Thank you very much, Christina. Thank you, friends and colleagues, for the opportunity to present to you this evening. I think it was almost 2 years to the day that I previously gave a presentation on the project. So in some ways this is going to be a bit of an update, but given that I'm sure there are some of you who didn't attend that presentation or previous presentations that I or a member of our team have given to various bird clubs, it'll also be an overview of the project and where we are at the moment. So as the name suggests, Saving Marion Island Seabird, the Mouse-Free Marion Project, this is an initiative to save an island and its remarkable wildlife. Marion Island truly is a living wonder of the world, and I'll hope that that'll come across in the presentation that I give this evening. However, it is an island that is facing a grave and growing threat, and our project, the Mouse-Free Marion Project, is an outcomes-driven conservation initiative that aims to address one of the most significant threats faced by the island and its wildlife. And this threat is the impacts of the invasive house mice on the island. So to address that threat, the eradication of mice is a necessary step. It's a means to an end. And I'm very fortunate to be the project manager for this initiative, and even more fortunate to be part of an incredible team that are working as are. And the team is even larger than just our core team. So formally, it is an initiative that's a collaboration between the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, who are the management authority for the island, and BirdLife South Africa. And BirdLife South Africa have also established the Mouse-Free Marion non-profit company as a mechanism to help facilitate the implementation of this initiative. But the team extends to even more than that, and it includes you, the public, because we can't do this without your support. And many of you have already helped support the project in various ways, from providing donations and support to just spreading the word of its importance. And my hope this evening is that this presentation continues to inspire you to continue those efforts and to provide the support that we need to help us advance the project. I also realize that I'm very fortunate in having been able to visit Marion Island a number of times. It is a remote island in the southern Indian Ocean. Not many people get to visit it. And I overwintered there in 1994, and then more recently, as part of the project planning, have been visiting the island as part of the annual relief voyages over the last few years. And it truly is an honor to visit this remarkable island haven. And what I thought I would do to start this webinar is to play you some video footage that was all taken during the most recent annual relief voyage, which took place in April, May this year. So it was a 3-week period. It's not the most amazing time to visit the island because many of the seasonal seabirds have left following their breeding efforts, but it still just gives you a sense of the inspiring nature of this island and the fact that it truly is a living wonder of the world. I hope that came across right. I was worried that it might come across a bit jerky, but as I said, that footage was all taken in a 3-week period in April, May this year, a month or so ago. Most of that taken on my cell phone, just showing you what an incredible place this is, how important it is and how deserving it is to receive our protection. Also taken in the 3-week period of this most recent takeover voyage were these, amongst many other photographs like them. These are photographs of both adult birds and chicks that have been nibbled and eaten by house mice. So just really highlighting the contrast between this incredible living wonder of the world and the threat that it faces and the imperative for us to do something about it. So just stepping back and to provide some context, the Marion Island forms part of a group of subantarctic islands that essentially form a ring around the continent of Antarctica. And to understand the ecological importance of these islands, it's useful to understand their position within the Southern Ocean. The Southern Ocean is amongst the most productive oceans in the world that supports a massive biomass of marine predators, marine mammals such as seals and whales and other cetaceans, and of course, seabirds. And so these islands are quite sparse, and some of those species have to come ashore to breed and to molt. And as you can see in this map over here, there isn't a lot of land. We have the continent of Antarctica, of course, but the majority of that is covered in ice, and so it doesn't provide breeding habitat for seabirds. So these subantarctic islands, which you can see dotted around the continent of Antarctica, are hugely important as breeding sites for a number of seabird species and are havens for this abundance of wildlife. And Marion and Prince Edward Island form part of this incredibly important group of subantarctic islands. It forms the Prince Edward Island group, comprising 2 islands. Marion is the larger of the 2 and is the main focus of our discussion this evening. And then Prince Edward Island is about 20 kilometers northeast of Marion Island and considerably smaller. And collectively, these islands host huge amounts and important global populations of seabirds, or globally important populations of seabirds. Here you see a colony of macaroni penguins with king penguins in the background. There are 3 other penguin species that occur in relatively large numbers on the island. And of course, we have the albatrosses. And the wandering albatross is perhaps the most iconic of all seabirds. And amongst these subantarctic islands, I would say that Marion and Prince Edward are even unique because of the high density and abundance of wandering albatrosses. Collectively, Prince Edward and Marion support about half of the world's population of wandering albatrosses, with Marion Island being the most important breeding site. And so if you look at other subantarctic islands, it's very rare to kind of see the density of wandering albatrosses that you see on Marion Island. Again, just highlighting its ecological importance from a conservation perspective. And although it's the surface nesting seabirds that dominate visually, the islands are also important for a number of burrow nesting species, such as this white-chinned petrel. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier the marine mammals. There are 2 species of fur seal, elephant seal, and that remarkable footage you saw earlier of Tammy Egerling, the killer whales that frequent the island. And the terrestrial ecology of the island is also very interesting, perhaps not diverse, but there are important plants and invertebrates on the island for which we as South Africa have a global responsibility in protecting and conserving. So for these reasons, the Prince Edward Islands, including Marion, are considered to be globally important, especially for seabirds, but also for other subantarctic biodiversity. And this is recognized through a number of scientific and legal designations, including its designation as an important bird and biodiversity area, a Ramsar site of international importance, and a special nature reserve. It is, in fact, South Africa's only special nature reserve, and this is the highest level of protection that is afforded under South African legislation. But of course, these designations themselves don't afford protection and conservation measures which the island might require. And we do know that the islands, and especially Marion Island, has been impacted by human activities. And it was the marine mammals that really inspired the first human landings to the island, although the landings on the island, should I say. Although humans discovered the island long before, it wasn't until the late 1700s and early 1800s that humans started landing on the island. And this was at the heyday of the seal exploitation era. A number of these subantarctic islands and even our own South African mainland shore were being exploited. The fur seal populations were being exploited for the pelts, and elephant seals on these subantarctic islands and in Antarctica were being harvested for their blubber, which would be rendered down to oil. This was a massive exploitation that led very rapidly to the decline in these populations, to the extent that it was no longer viable to harvest these species by the middle of the 1800s. And so that then led to a reduction in the direct exploitation. And I think what then happened was that those seal populations started recovering. And that's an important principle in our conservation discussion, because it shows us that these wildlife species have the means of being able to respond positively to a reduction of the pressures and the threats that they face. So they're resilient. They can recover from these threats if they're given the opportunity to do so. But the seal hunters that came to the island, the impact that they had on those species that they were harvesting directly wasn't the only impact that they had on the island, unfortunately, because with the seal hunters, they unfortunately brought with them mice, a stowaway, on their vessels and in their supplies. And mice were introduced accidentally to Marion Island sometime in the early 1800s, sometime before 1818. Fortunately, Prince Edward Island did not have any mice that were introduced accidentally to that island, and so Prince Edward Island has escaped the impacts of mice. But the seal hunters left an unfortunate legacy, which has endured and has actually grown to this day. As I mentioned earlier, the direct seal harvesting continued up until about the 1850s, and visits to the island were very infrequent thereafter. And it wasn't until the mid-1900s that humans started visiting the island more frequently. And South Africa formally annexed the islands for strategic reasons in 1948. And fortunately, this marked a movement away from an era of direct exploitation to one of research and conservation. And so the South Africans established a weather station and a research base on Marion Island. And as I mentioned, this really kind of initiated a new process and era of conservation management and research. And South Africa really has an incredibly proud record of the research and conservation management that it's undertaken on Marion and Prince Edward Island. There have been teams that have been visiting the island annually since 1948. And a number of researchers have been involved in continuing what had become really well-recognized and respected long-term monitoring programs on all aspects of the ecology, geology, and other aspects of the island. And this has led to a number of publications, which has improved our understanding of the ecology, the biology, history of the island, and really has indicated, this has shown that South Africa has been at the forefront of conservation management and research on Marion Island. There have been other human-induced impacts that have had an impact on Marion Island. And we need to consider the arrival and the impact of cats, but importantly also the eradication of cats. And so it was in 1948 that only 5 cats, but they were not sterilized, were brought to the island. And they were brought to the island by one of the first teams because of the nuisance factor that was ascribed to the mice. So the mice were in the base and were causing all sorts of damage. And so some of the first teams decided that it would be quite useful to bring a few cats to the island to deal with these pesky mice. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, these cats were not neutered, and you know, it seems like a crazy thing to us now, but it was a different era and a different mindset. They weren't thinking about these sorts of conservation issues in the way that we do today. But unsurprisingly, those 5 cats learned very quickly that rather than hanging around in the base and catching mice, there was a huge abundance of naive seabirds out there on the island. And so very quickly, a feral cat population became established. And by the 1970s, that introduced population of 5 cats had grown to 2,000 feral cats that were responsible for killing almost 500,000 seabirds each and every single year. So this led to the importance of trying to address this threat. Marion Island is a very large island. It's 30,000 hectares in extent. And so it took a few pioneering scientists to come up with the idea of eradicating cats and putting in place a plan to do so. Many thought it was something that couldn't be done. The island was just much bigger than anybody had considered would be possible to achieve an eradication of this scale. But they persisted using a sort of scientific and systematic approach, trialing a number of methods and using a number of methods between the 1970s, and eventually by 1991, we had successfully eradicated cats on the island, largely, as I say, due to the inspiring leadership of people like Professor Matan Bester and others who stuck with it, who persisted, who tried different approaches, who used the data to inform their approach in an adaptive management context. And this was an incredible feat, and South Africa was considered to be pioneer in this era, in this field. And up until fairly recently, 2018, Marion Island was the largest island on which cats had been eradicated. And as I mentioned, South Africa were considered world leaders in this regard. And this has been included in a case study in Brian Huntley's wonderful book, looking at successful case studies for what works in terms of kind of conservation approaches in Africa. And rightly so, I'd suggest. And from our perspective, for the Mouse Marion Project, we see this as a fascinating example to follow and one to build on. And we really want to follow in the footsteps of the example that has been provided by the Marion Island Cat Eradication Project. The principles are quite similar, but the techniques are very different given the different biology of the cats versus the rodents that we're dealing with. So with the cats now eradicated from Marion Island, we're left with a single mammalian predator on Marion Island, and that is the house mouse. I mentioned earlier that there have been many long-term programs and wonderful research projects that have been undertaken on Marion Island, and that we've got a very good understanding of the ecology, biology, and conservation needs of the island. And a lot of this research has shown that this humble house mice has become one of the most significant ecosystem engineers on Marion Island. Many of the projects and research initiatives that have been undertaken on Marion have demonstrated the impact that the mice are having and have had on the invertebrates of the island. Invertebrates such as this flightless moth over here, the larval stage of which is really important for nutrient cycling. To the extent that the mice have essentially kind of reduced the population of these macroinvertebrates to absolutely negligible levels. And by doing that, the impacts have also extended to the only shorebird on the island, the lesser sheathbill, which you see over here, because historically in the wintertime, the lesser sheathbill would forage and would target macroinvertebrates, because in the wintertime there are far fewer seabirds breeding, which is where the lesser sheathbill would normally forage in the summertime breeding season, the peak breeding season of those summer breeding species. So, as I say, long-term studies have highlighted the impacts of mice on these terrestrial species. And also the research has shown that the densities of mice have increased over time significantly by almost 500% over the last 30 years. And you might think that this is because of the removal of cats. And in fact, very little of the increase in the densities of mice has got to do with the removal of cats, because we know that cats actually focused most of their predation on the seabirds on the island, and the mice were not an important prey component. Certainly they were eating mice as well, but the main reason for the increase in the densities of mice has been due to the changing climate. Over the last 30 to 50 years, the climate on Marion Island has become both warmer and drier, and this has led to an increase in the length of the breeding season that has then enabled the mice to produce more litters and has increased the density of mice, especially towards the end of the summer period. And the mice have essentially outstripped the invertebrate prey on which it used to rely. And then in the early 2000s, something shifted. In 2003, that scientists made the grisly discovery that mice had now taken to eating seabird chicks alive in their nests. This really was a grim kind of finding, and something that caused us lots of concern. And I'm going to show a video coming up next, which is not for sensitive viewers, but I think it's an important video to show because it highlights visually the distressing nature of these attacks by mice on the albatrosses. So clearly, these mouse attacks on albatross chicks must be distressing. It's certainly distressing for us conservationists too, and is what drives our work to plan and undertake the eradication operation. So initially in those early 2000s, after the initial discovery, the observations were infrequent, they were localized, they're not very extensive, but the concern always was that this is a behavior that could spread. And certainly the research that has continued to be undertaken has shown that that is the case. The frequency of attacks, the number of species, the extent of area on Marion Island has all increased over time. And apart from the direct evidence that I just showed you in that video clip, we can also look at Prince Edward Island. I mentioned earlier that Prince Edward Island has escaped the introduction of any introduced mammalian predators, both cats and mice. And so it is a wonderful control site that we can use to compare the two islands, because other than those impacts and other impacts due to human impacts on the island, the species on those islands are going to be facing similar climatic issues. And so we can compare the two islands to understand the extent to which mice are impacting the ecosystem. And there are huge differences between these islands. Prince Edward Island is remarkably pristine for subantarctic islands. It only has a couple of introduced plants. As I mentioned, doesn't have any introduced mammalian predators. And I've never had the privilege of visiting Prince Edward Island, but I know from colleagues who have, and there are some colleagues that have visited at the end of last year, and they come back with stories that are just astounding, saying that the place is just humming with invertebrates. The subterranean part of the island is just heaving with burrowing petrels. And in direct contrast with Marion Island, where it's very clear that the ecosystem integrity has been impoverished as a result of, but now presently, the impacts of mice on the island. And in this timeline, there have been a number of step changes that have happened. And another one that is causing us huge concern happened in April 2023, when Dr. Mel Kernan and colleagues from Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University and the Fitzpatrick Institute discovered the first evidence of mice attacking and killing adult wandering albatrosses. Now, this is of huge concern because demographically, the impacts are far more severe, because in these long-lived species such as seabirds, these populations require high adult survival. Because they breed so infrequently, high adult survival is really important to ensure that the population remains stable or grows over time. If you start taking out adult birds, that has a very severe impact on the population trajectories. And so in April, May 2023, there was one particular part of the island where Marion and her colleagues had observed adult birds that had the telltale signs of being impacted by mice. And unfortunately, this has extended. This behavior and the impacts have extended. Professor Peter Ryan and colleagues have recently, in this last takeover voyage, undertaken a survey of the whole island and are in the process of analyzing that data. But I can report that there were a number of other areas where adult wandering albatrosses have been eaten by mice. So I'm sure that from a conservation perspective, you understand that it's important for us to know the impacts that these predation events have not only on individual birds, but on the populations, so that we can work out what the likely impacts are going to be on the population trajectories. And an expert assessment of this highlighted that the majority of seabird species on Marion Island are at real risk of local or functional extinction in the presence of mice. 19 of the 29 species that are thought to breed on Marion Island are considered to be threatened by mouse predation. Now, that really is a worrying statistic, and one which is driving our conservation imperative. The good news is that there is a solution, and it builds on the outcomes of many previous initiatives similar to the one that we are planning to undertake. And really, this is due to the pioneering efforts of the New Zealanders. Certainly when I was on Marion Island 30 years ago, nobody would have considered it possible to be able to eradicate mice on an island the size of Marion Island. But due to development in eradication techniques in the last 30 years, particularly the refinement of aerial baiting methods, the eradication of mice from an island such as Marion is now considered feasible. And there have been a number of operations that have been undertaken, and of course each operation has its own set of challenges, the outcomes of which have helped refine the tools and approaches for subsequent operations. And there have been, as I'm showing in this illustration over here, stepwise advances in the methods, in the technology, in the skills and the knowledge that has enabled ever more ambitious projects to be completed successfully. And technology has been really important in this, as has the use, as I say, of aerial baiting techniques. And essentially, the only method that has been used successfully to eradicate rodents on large oceanic islands is the use of a fleet of helicopters that are guided by GPSs that have underslung bait buckets with mechanical spinners that fly very predetermined, accurate bait swaths or flight paths, which they then use to ensure that the entire island is sown with a specially formulated rodenticide bait. So there's been a huge amount of research that has gone into both the bait and to the helicopter component of the operation. And this illustration over here with the slide shows the helicopter operation on South Georgia, which is an island that I'm sure is familiar with many of you, even if you haven't visited it. But this was an operation undertaken about 10 years ago and successfully eradicated both rats and mice. And what I'm going to do now, and I'm hoping it's going to work because it's an online video, but what I thought I would do is to show you some video footage of what an aerial operation looks like. This is a video of helicopter operations on Antipodes Island in New Zealand, which shows the technique that is used to aerially bait these subantarctic islands. So please bear with me, and I hope that this is going to work. Did that come out? Did that come out all right, Christina?
It was a bit jerky and we lost the sound, but I think people got the gist of it. Maybe we could share the link to that video with everyone in the chat afterwards. I don't know if I see Keith has just posted it. I'll just make it visible to everyone. Yeah, so people can go and watch the clip
Okay,
by
great.
themselves. Yeah, but you can continue. Thanks, Anton.
Okay, thanks very much, Christina. Yeah, so as I mentioned, the use of helicopters with underslung bait buckets to sow bait across the entire island to make sure that every mouse territory receives enough bait for every single mouse or rodent to consume a lethal dose is the only method and approach that has been used successfully on large oceanic islands. And it's the approach that we're using because it is proven and tried and tested. We often receive questions about whether alternative methods have been considered, and we certainly have. We've considered and we are aware of a number of other methods that have been used or considered for very small islands or for control purposes. But it's important to bear in mind that we're talking here about an eradication initiative where we aim to remove every individual mouse rather than trying to control the population at a low level, which practically is just not possible on an island the size of Marion. And as I mentioned, the tools and methods that we're using are based on those which have got a proven track record. Of course, one modifies some of the details, such as the baiting strategy, to make sure that it's fit for purpose for our particular circumstances. But we do not want to be guinea pigs to try something that has never been shown to work before in similar circumstances. We're aware of emerging technology, of course, and we keep a watching brief on that to see to what extent it can help us with aspects of our project. But we feel that it would be foolish to kind of to wait for tools that have an uncertain kind of future promise. And so we're focusing very much on tools that we know have been successfully used in operations similar to ours. And there've been some recent reviews of this tool that I have talked about, and it is a remarkably successful conservation tool. The majority of islands on which these eradication initiatives are undertaken succeed in eradicating the target species, whether they're rats, mice, or other species that are being targeted. And importantly, not only is there a successful outcome in terms of the eradication, but also there are successful outcomes in terms of the ecological gains that accrue from those interventions. A rebounding of impacted species such as seabirds and invertebrates and plants. And this next slide just shows a kind of a smattering of posts about projects that have been undertaken over the last 20 or so years, news posts. And as I mentioned, the majority of these operations are successful in their attempts to eradicate these invasive species from the island. Of course, not all of them succeed, and we'll get to that in a subsequent slide. We've also got to consider the specific attributes of the island. So each, as I mentioned earlier, island has attributes which inform the technique that is used. They have their own set of circumstances and challenges which need to be overcome or incorporated into the planning. One of them for us is the size of Marion Island. It is a very large island at 30,000 hectares. It will be the largest island on which an eradication is attempted of rodents in a single operation. South Georgia is much larger than Marion Island, but given the glaciers on South Georgia, it could be compartmentalized into different units, which could be done over several years. We don't have that possibility on Marion. We need to undertake the eradication in a single continuous intervention, removing the mice faster than they can breed. Other projects have challenges associated with multiple species that are being targeted, perhaps human populations that live on the island with livestock that need to be managed. So each project have their challenges and issues that need to be addressed and overcome through the planning of that project. And I think it's important to note that these eradication projects, especially on large islands and especially in remote locations such as Marion, are highly complex endeavors. There are a number of different elements where there are interdependencies of these. So there's an element of scientific research that needs to be undertaken, not only to demonstrate the impacts of mice, but to look at things like the baiting strategy, the the ecological parameters of mice on the island, how those differ across the island, and how that feeds into our baiting strategy. The logistical planning for an operation like this is hugely challenging. There's a lot of planning that goes into it. There is a number of regulatory requirements that we need to meet, a huge amount of logistical planning, operational planning and management, and of course, fundraising and public relations are all important components with interdependencies between all of these different facets. And of course, just because eradication projects work on Island A doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be viable on Island B. One has to look at the specifics of the island in question and undertake a feasibility assessment, and then use that to inform the development of various project plans and operational plans. And this is exactly what we've done. In 2015, we had an international expert undertake a feasibility assessment, which then concluded that the eradication of mice on Marion Island is technically feasible. It highlighted a number of challenges that would need to be addressed in the project planning, and these have all been incorporated into the development of the baiting strategy and the planning for that. And of course, one has to keep these things updated, because this is a process. There are a number of techniques, and the sort of skills and the expertise and knowledge develops all the time, and our understanding of issues develops as well. And so it's important that we update our feasibility assessment, which we're doing currently, to make sure that we have the most up-to-date understanding of the risks, the knowledge gaps, and how best to address those. One of the kind of best practice principles with these kind of initiatives is to make sure that you have the appropriate expertise. And although we've got a lot of experience in South Africa at managing invasive species, especially invasive plant species, but also, as I mentioned earlier, we can be very proud of our record of eradicating cats on Marion Island. We don't have experience at aerial baiting of oceanic islands to eradicate rodents. And so it was important for us from the outset to ensure that we co-opted the necessary expertise, which we were very lucky to do by recruiting Keith Springer as our operations manager. And there are probably a handful of individuals in the world who have got the kind of experience that we need for a project like this. And Keith really is, and he'll probably be embarrassed about me saying this, at the forefront of that group. And so we're very lucky to have him as part of our core project team. As I mentioned, this is a partnership. It's a partnership primarily between the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment and BirdLife South Africa, and through BirdLife South Africa, the Mouse-Free Marion non-profit company. And so with partnership initiatives, especially for highly complex projects, it's important to make sure that we establish and manage the various structures, the governance and management structures. And you can see in this slide the structures that we have in place for the planning phase of the project. And it's important that we have a joined up approach to all aspects of the project, to make sure that we are all working together to advance the project and to make sure that it's moving in the right direction and addressing issues as they emerge. And in many respects, projects like this are about the identification and management of risks. And so there, as I mentioned earlier, a number of facets that we need to consider and investigate and interrogate. And as we undertake those and we obtain the outcomes, we need to make sure that measures that we put in place and issues that we need to undertake are fed back into a review of the feasibility of the eradication initiative. And so we've been undertaking trials on the island, which are built on trials that have happened elsewhere, that follow on from outcomes of other initiatives where there have been findings that we think are important for us to investigate further on Marion Island. And then a framework for this planning is that it's important to understand that there are a number of factors which can influence the successful outcome of an operation like this, both in the planning phase, which is where we are at the moment, and in the actual operational phase. And it's important to note that the planning phase is the one which is most time consuming. We need to make sure that we get the planning right, because it's the comprehensiveness and the degree of rigor in the planning that influences the implementation and the outcome of that implementation. And so there's a huge amount of work that goes into interrogating all of these different aspects to understand how we can maximize our chance of success in the planning of the baiting strategy, so that when we go to the island, we are confident that we've done everything we can to identify and address all of the risks. As I mentioned earlier, the majority of the eradication initiatives on these islands targeting rodents do succeed, but in some cases they don't. And those of you that have followed our news posts through our website will know that in recent years, there have been 2 high-profile projects that have unfortunately not succeeded. The one on Gough Island in 2021, and then more recently, the initiative to eradicate mice on Midway Atoll last year. It's important to say that we don't know definitively what caused the failures of those projects. We may never know for sure, but there are a number of hypotheses that have been put forward to explain possible factors, or to put forward possible factors that might have contributed either individually, but more likely collectively, to the failed outcomes of those initiatives. And this hasn't deterred us or dissuaded us from the importance, the integrity and success of the approach that we plan to use, or the approach that we are using, or our intent to undertake the operation. But it has caused us to pause, to engage with our colleagues involved in those operations, and indeed the wider island eradication community, to discuss those factors that have been put forward as possible reasons for the failed attempts in those 2 operations. And for us, as the Mouse v Marion Project, to initiate further research so that we can dive deeper into some of these issues and make sure that we understand all of these aspects as best we can, so that they can be addressed if they do apply to our case in our planning of the baiting strategy. So we have been undertaking work over a number of years on Marion Island, and the outcomes of those 2 initiatives have informed the development of further research projects, and we are in the process of updating or having developed an updated research plan. And the work that we're doing involves looking at issues around bait. We're also investigating the weather parameters on Marion Island, and the weather is going to be one of the key challenges that we're going to need to address. It's one of those things that are not in our direct control, and the way that we manage that in terms of the risk is we make sure that we allow enough time on the island to ensure that we have the best chance of getting the amount of time that we need through the windows of opportunity to complete the baiting operation. And so in this image over here, you can see Camilla, who's setting up a remote trail camera, which we use to monitor the base level of clouds, which influences our ability to fly helicopters and to bait using helicopters on the island. We realized that collecting data over a few years prior to the eradication to build up a sort of understanding of the average conditions doesn't necessarily mean that we will experience those particular conditions in the year that we go to the island to bait, but it gives us a better understanding of the extent to which we need to accommodate the weather conditions and the time that we need to allow for us to complete the baiting operation successfully. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier that there's been a huge amount of work done on Marion Island on all aspects of the ecology and the species and the biology of the species. So we've got a very good understanding of the island and its ecology. And it's important that we continue to fill some of the gaps that do exist, so that we can use that in a framework to monitor the ecological outcomes of the eradication operation. Ecological outcomes that relate to the invertebrates, to the sheathbill, to the plants, to the seabirds, of course. And this is all done through partnerships again, partnerships with Michelle Gree from the University of Pretoria, with our colleagues at the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, and the Fitzpatrick Institute and the Nelson Mandela University. This really is a collaborative initiative in which all of the people involved are working towards achieving this incredible conservation outcome. And then a project like this, also it's important that we undergo regular, rigorous technical peer review. And we're very lucky to have the services of the Island Eradication Advisory Group, which is the expert body on these sorts of issues. And they provide us inputs and feedback on the technical plans that we develop on various aspects of our planning. And then we also have a scientific and technical advisory group comprising kind of about 50 experts in different areas that are available to us to provide feedback on a range of issues that are important for the planning of a project like ours. And then another important kind of issue in the planning for a project like this is to consider the impacts of the operation on those species which we're trying to protect. There is no perfect solution to these sorts of initiatives. But fortunately, we know a lot about the non-target species impacts from previous operations, and also through our understanding of the biology and ecology of species that are likely to or are thought to be susceptible at an individual level to some of the impacts of the baiting operation. And so, given our understanding of the bait, of the toxin, and the way that it flows in the environment, and also, as I say, the knowledge of the ecology and biology of species that might be considered to be susceptible, we have a good understanding of the potential impacts. And it's important to note that operations like this proceed on the basis that the ecological outcomes need to be to far outweigh any of the short-term ecological costs of the operation, and that those costs need to be reversible. And so, in addition to our understanding, we commissioned an independent expert assessment of the potential impacts, and that was chaired by Professor Peter Ryan, and they have produced an assessment of the potential impacts, which has also considered the mitigation measures that we'll be using or that apply to our project. And one of these is that the operation is undertaken in wintertime, when many of the seabird species are not on the island. These are non-resident species that leave once they finish breeding. The fact that the majority of mice that die, they die after they start feeling unwell, and they retreat to their burrows where they do not become accessible to, or where they would not be accessible to scavenging species. And one of the key conclusions from this assessment report is that given the ecosystem-wide impacts of mice that I've mentioned in this presentation, there is little doubt that the long-term benefits of a successful eradication would substantially outweigh the costs of non-target mortality. So we accept that there will be some non-target mortality, but the assessment is that non-target mortality is not significant at a population level and does not justify not proceeding with an operation like this, given the overwhelmingly substantially positive impacts of the baiting operation. And then also, one has to consider the ethics of an operation like this. So ethics are perhaps more subjective than the conservation kind of imperatives. And we feel that the project, the Mouse Marion Project, is one that is rooted on values, on science, on policy, on the regulatory mandate, and on best practice. And the values linked to this being an important conservation imperative, as I've mentioned already. The science reflects the demonstrated impacts that the mice are having on a number of species and on the island as a whole. The policy is led by the evidence of harm and the fact that we've exhausted all alternative means first, and are proceeding with the only approach that we know will give us a high chance of success. And then best practice, linking to the fact that this is the most humane approach that also ensures the highest chance of success. And so, from an ethical perspective, our view is that doing nothing is not a neutral option. I've indicated that the use of helicopters to sow a specially formulated rodenticide bait is the only approach that's worked to eradicate rodents on large oceanic islands. And for Marion Island, the cost of doing nothing, which is the alternative, will be that most seabird species breeding on the island will continue to suffer and are likely to be driven to local or functional extinction. So our view very much is that taking action to address the threat, rather than knowing what is at stake and taking no action, represents a responsible, ethical, and compassionate approach to the conservation of the island and its native inhabitants. And of course, we need to consider the budget. And these operations are costly. Our current estimate for the budget is that it will cost approximately 555 million rand, or about, that should be $29 million. And that is a lot of money, certainly by South African standards, but I think even globally. But I think it's important to bear in mind that this is a once-off investment for permanent and globally significant biodiversity benefits that, once achieved, will require low cost to sustain. The only thing that we really need to do to sustain and protect that investment is to ensure adequate and strong biosecurity, which is something that we should be doing anyway. And so I think, one needs to consider the costs of projects like this in a sense that you have a large upfront investment that you amortize essentially in perpetuity, which, if you consider it in that respect, you think about it as something which delivers huge returns on investment. And in fact, isn't a significant cost for what you are achieving in perpetuity. The other important point to make is that we need to make sure that we resource the project to ensure that we cover the costs that are required. We are not under pressure to cut costs because we need to overachieve. Keith Broom, who is the chair of the Island Eradication Advisory Group, has indicated before that resourcing is whatever it takes. To underachieve eradication means failure, and the approach must be to overachieve it. And that's a driving principle for us, both in the planning and the operational phases of a project like this. And I think it's useful to kind of look and compare the cost per hectare against some other islands. And you can see Marion Island on the end there. And of course, one would expect economies of scale. And so you would expect that on a large island, you would expect some savings. But still, I think it just shows that we're not out of the ballpark in terms of the cost of a project like this. And the biodiversity benefits are significant and I would say priceless. So how do we go about raising funds for a project of this nature? And our model is that it is a public-private partnership. The government have committed funding to the project, but we also need to raise funds from the private sector. And we're using a number of different approaches and methods. We are engaging with high net worth individuals and philanthropists. It is a typical capital campaign strategy where we hope to get a large chunk of our money from high net worth individuals, but we're also looking at novel finance mechanisms to help leverage funds to support the project. And of course, all the money that people like yourselves have donated, hugely appreciated and contribute towards the project and kind of help progress it. So far, we have raised just over a quarter of our target, and so that highlights the challenge that we face. And we know that the money's out there. We've got many irons in the fire, and we have initiated a couple of new initiatives that we hope will kind of bear fruit in the coming months. So, but again, we would appreciate all the support that you, the public, can provide. Maybe of organizations, individuals that would be very keen to invest in an important project like this. And if you do, please do get in touch with us. So the project has received a very high degree of support, both within South Africa from Minister Barbara Creasy, and also internationally. Peter Harrison, who I'm sure many of you all know, he's one of the most well-respected kind of seabird ecologists and experts. He's also a patron of the project and is a great supporter and has helped us progress the planning of the project and help raise funds for us. So people like Peter, Professor Tony Martin, who led the South Georgia Eradication Initiative, Graça Michel, who's the former First Lady of both South Africa and Mozambique, Patricia Zarita, who is the previous CEO of BirdLife International, Professor John Croxall, who is one of the world leading experts on seabirds and marine predators. All of these people and many others have lent their support to the project and are helping kind of in various ways. So just a few more slides to finish off. The project really is an opportunity to solve a significant conservation threat, and it's quite unique in that regard. Many of us that have been involved in conservation for many years will agree that it is unique to have a situation where you can solve once and for all a conservation threat rather than just mitigating or containing it. If we eradicate mice, we can essentially turn back the clock. And just to show you again, this isn't really a timeline, because I mentioned earlier that the preparatory phase, which is the initial phase over here, is the most time-consuming part of an initiative like this. It's the part that we really need to get right, that then informs and leads to success in the later kind of components of this. And so we're in this phase over here, both in terms of our research, our planning, our fundraising. We're planning at the moment, our target date for the baiting operation is 2027, but that is contingent on us raising the funds in time and securing all of the regulatory requirements that we need. And of course, there is then a post-eradication monitoring phase where we both confirm the success of the operation, but also we start quantifying and reporting the ecological outcomes of the operation. So in terms of the timelines, as I mentioned, our target year for the baiting operation is 2027, but it's important to note that we can't start the baiting operation until we know that we have sufficient funds and everything else in place to complete it successfully. And in this regard, I'd like to I've put up the slide here of one of the chapters of Lewis Pugh's book titled 21 Yaks and a Speedo, How to Achieve Your Impossible. Lewis Pugh, as I'm sure many of you know, is, we will claim him as a South African. I know he sort of straddles between South Africa and the UK. He is the UN patron of the oceans and a great supporter of marine conservation initiatives. And in this book, he has many lessons which he himself has used to achieve the seeming impossible. And this one I found particularly apt in terms of where we find ourselves here at the moment. And he says that the quickest way to get a job done is to do it with excellence the first time. And so this is really a driving principle for us. We need to make sure that we have everything in place so that when we leave Cape Town on the SA Gullis to undertake the operation, we don't feel like there is just a few more things that we wish we could have done before we proceeded on that journey. So Lewis Pugh's book is about how to achieve your impossible. Is the eradication of mice on Marion Island impossible? No, it's certainly possible. Our feasibility assessment shows that that's the case, and we're confident that we can achieve success. Is it an ambitious project? Absolutely. Is it an important and critical project? Certainly. And it's important because we need to stop images like this being the impression of Marion Island that is presented to the world. The problem of the mice on Marion Island is tragic. But the Mouse-Free Marion Project is one of hope and of restoration, of rescuing embattled species and of saving a precious part of our planet. And I'd like to suggest that even though the outcome is yet to be determined, we're still in the planning phase, it is the action and the intent to undertake the operation to save the globally important seabirds and the island that is positive. So rather than the previous image, this is the image that we want to promote and to use as the flagship for Marion Island. Majestic albatrosses soaring safely at sea, just offshore of their protected breeding sites, which are free of introduced predators. We have the opportunity to save the wandering albatross and the other species, the many other species that are impacted by mice at Marion. And I'd like to suggest that future generations will neither understand nor forgive us if we carelessly lose this iconic ocean wanderer. Their fate is in our hands. That's a massive responsibility, a responsibility that we can and must meet. So I'd like to thank you very much all for the opportunity to speak to you this evening and to apologize profusely for the breaks in the presentation. It got me a bit flustered as well. I kind of wasn't really sure what was happening, but I do hope that you have enjoyed it, that you continue to be inspired to help support the project, because it wouldn't be possible without your support. This is a collective effort. We really need everybody's assistance to get to the point where we can make a difference for the seabirds of Marion Island, for the sub-Antarctic, and for this remarkable island. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Anton. That was an amazing presentation. You didn't seem flustered at all. So I'm very glad that we managed to sort out, well, you managed to sort out the internet issues and we could hear the entire presentation. So thank you very much. Yeah, it's amazing work that you and the team are doing, and very, yeah, absolutely worthwhile and vital. So thank you very much. There have been quite a lot of questions in the Q&A box, but Keith and Sue have been frantically typing and answering them. So I'd like to just suggest to our viewers to please go and have a look at those answered questions that should appear in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We won't have time to go through all of them. There's over 20 of them. So, and given that it's now 8:15, I think we will probably just leave it there. Anton, I don't know if you do want to try answering a couple of questions. Your internet does seem to be holding, but I would hate to lose you in the middle of answering questions. If
I'm happy to give it a bash, and I'm sure Keith and Sue can help as well. I'm on my phone connection now, which I didn't think would hold, but perhaps it's better than the Wi-Fi connection.
Seems to be. Well, Sue and Keith have done a very good job of answering a lot of them. So I'll just look through for some to ask. But just before we get to that, and before people leave the webinar, just to remind everyone, we'll be back with another conservation conversations in 2 weeks' time, and that time we will be hearing from Andrew McKechnie, who will be speaking about hibernation and torpor in birds, which is not something that we often think about. And then also just to say, if anyone is not able to go through all the answered questions, read all the answers to the questions, and would like me to send you those questions, you can email conversations@birdlife.org.za, and I can email you a copy of those. So I'm just going to put that in the chat. That's conversations at birdlife.org.za. Okay, now that's out the way. Let's get to some questions. Okay, so there's one question around from Billy Mills, asking about the kind of mechanics of how the bait will be spread. So what is the diameter of the spread from the mechanized spread, and what is the interval of each helicopter traverse? And plus, do you envisage doing more than one phase?
Perhaps Keith would be well placed to answer that. Christina, Keith, are you happy to take that one?
Yes, but Christina, I'll get you to prompt me partway through for other parts of the question. But in terms of the width or the swath width of bait from each helicopter pass, we usually work on about 80 meters. So the helicopter's flying at perhaps 150, 200 feet or 50 meters above ground level, and it's spreading an 80-meter swath. To make sure there are no gaps in the coverage, we overlap the swaths so that we can be confident that if the helicopter was slightly offline, there won't be any gaps in bait coverage on the ground. And so we do that right across the island. And in relation to the number of applications of bait, we apply two. We apply the bait twice. So that's a full coverage of the island, usually about 2 weeks apart. But the weather, that's ideally, but the weather has the final say on that. So one full application of the island, 2 weeks, and then go back and do it again. And in addition, we go to steep ground and coastal areas, and we apply more bait there just to basically tidy up any potential edges or on cliffs where bait might have bounced to the ground at the bottom of the cliff. We apply a bit more on those areas just to make sure that some has a chance of sticking. Were there other bits in the question that I missed?
No, I think you covered everything.
Okay.
But another question has popped in from Mike Lovell, which you did touch on, saying, how do you ensure adequate coverage of the bait on the island's cliffs? And I know there are also other features on Marion that make it quite difficult to ensure a good coverage of bait. Maybe you can just address that briefly.
Yeah, so probably one area of concern for us is lava tubes and caves. the bait spread by helicopters doesn't penetrate into those areas. It'll get into the mouths of caves, but not any further than a couple of meters. So they are a concern for us because we know mice live in those features. But the research that's been done, particularly on Gough Island, a little bit on Antipodes, and also on Marion, by a mark recapture trials, have shown that mice that live inside those caves have always come out to forage outside the cave entrance, and so we're really reliant on that being the case for every such lava tube and cave. But we think it is a risk, but there's not much we can do about it. We'll try and manually spread bait inside some known caves, but we don't know of all the location of all the lava tubes on Marion, and there's hundreds of them, so it probably wouldn't be feasible to do anyway. So we're really reliant on a thorough coverage of bait across the island and mice coming out of those features and foraging and consuming bait.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. And I saw an earlier question which you answered by typing from Rob Simmons asking about the buildings and the old base, and I understand the old base has now been removed, and all the other buildings will be hand baited as well.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, there's another couple of questions come in, so maybe we'll just do two more. One from Shashi, which is asking, what is the risk of the birds eating the chemical baits? I don't know, Anton or Keith, who would like to take that one?
I'm happy to respond, Christina and Sassy.
Thanks, Anton.
Yeah, fortunately for us, all of the birds except one species on the island are seabirds, and so they feed out at sea on marine prey. There are a couple of scavenging species, and some of those might be interested in the bait, and also might be interested in dead mice. And we know from previous operations that the majority, over 75, 80, 85% of mice that die underneath the ground in their burrows. And so, as I mentioned in the presentation, are less accessible or are not accessible at that point to the scavenging species. Certainly the trials that we have done to date on Marion have suggested on a trial basis that the birds that we thought might be interested in the bait don't seem to be as interested. Also in the operation, often you dye the bait green so that it's less attractive to birds. It might be that there are some individuals that are interested and consume bait. But as I say, this is why it's important to undertake a rigorous assessment of those non-target impacts. So we don't expect there to be a population level impact. We know from previous operations that there will be some individuals that will die, but that shouldn't detract us from going ahead because of the significant kind of ecological kind of benefit from this operation. There are other islands where you've got terrestrial birds that perhaps are more susceptible to eating bait. We're quite fortunate in that, as I say, the majority of birds on the island are seabirds, focusing on a marine prey.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, the ecological benefits definitely outweigh the costs in this case. Kind of related question from Jean, asking how long the bait remains viable, considering the weather and all the other conditions on Marion.
It's a good question, and one which we are investigating. It depends on a number of factors. It depends on the weather, the soil microorganisms, the habitat in which the bait is sown, and so it's important that the bait, one of the sort of principles and for these sorts of operations is that we need to make sure that the bait persists for at least 4 nights to ensure that there is enough bait for every individual on the island, including subordinate individuals. And so we've been doing trials, and certainly in terms of persistence, it's difficult to test that on a small scale in the presence of mice because they eat up the bait very quickly. But certainly, given the tests that we've done and obviously outcomes of previous eradication operations, the bait is sufficient to last for that period of time and is designed to persist in these subantarctic climate and weather conditions. I don't know, Keith, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, thanks, Anton. If it's not consumed within the first week or so, it's gradually broken down by invertebrates and weathering. So in some sheltered locations, it can last for months, but it's being broken down sort of all of the time, getting smaller and smaller in terms of the mass of the pellets. But as Anton said, the critical thing for us is that it lasts, the first, ideally 5 days, and it's got a little bit of wax content to provide a little bit of water resistance or weather resistance. So it will break down, but we would normally expect to find very little evidence of bait after a couple of months.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. The questions are still flooding in, but I'm conscious of time and the viewership is dwindling, although I know that people are very interested in this project. So maybe we just answer a couple more. So Marina asks if there's any intention to keep a few of the birds that might eat the bait in a different place to make sure they'd survive through the baiting phase. Anton, I know this is something that happened on Gough, and it's something that you have been thinking about. So perhaps you can, just answer that question.
Sure, Christina. Thanks, Marina, for that question. It is another good one, and it is one that is often considered in these kinds of operations, but as a last resort. So keeping birds in captivity on remote islands isn't straightforward. It requires a whole project and initiative all by itself, and it does increase the complexity of the project and therefore also potentially increase the risks of failure. So it's not used as an intervention or a method ordinarily, and we did request the independent panel that did the assessment of the non-target impacts if that was something that was needed. There were some trials done on Marion Island with sheathbills to see how easily they could be kept in captivity for periods of time, and sheathbills have proven to be incredibly difficult to keep in captivity. So given that outcome, but also given the assessment of the non-target impacts, the panel that undertook that assessment concluded that not only wasn't it necessary to undertake to keep birds in captivity, but also it could increase various risks associated with the project, and so it wasn't recommended. The other thing is that we're quite lucky in that we have neighboring Prince Edward Island, which does have healthy populations of sheathbills, for example, and so those could be seen as a reservoir population. If and we don't anticipate this being the outcome or the case, there are a large number of sheathbills that do die. We've at least got the reservoir kind of insurance population on Prince Edward Island, which that can be used as a sort of buffer, and birds would be kind of reintroduced from there. We don't expect that will be needed, but that is a far more effective way of looking at sheathbills than by keeping them in captivity.
Great, thanks for that. One question that I see Sue has now answered, but I think is an important point from Itai, asking, what are the chances of the mice refraining from eating the bait and therefore continuing their attacks on the seabirds?
Sue's answered that. Sue, do you want to answer it verbally as well?
I can indeed. Can you all hear me?
Yes, very well.
So Itai, we've been doing we're doing ongoing experiments on the island to assess if some of the mice don't eat the bait, if they prefer not to eat it. Those are continuing with a few different modified types of bait to see what they prefer. And then we are also planning a bait trial, which will be very similar to the actual operation, a large-scale trial, which we hope will happen next year, but if not next year, the following year. And we'll spread the bait from helicopters over quite a large area on the island, several hundred hectares. And then we can see exactly what you've asked. We can get a sense if there are any mice remaining in the middle of that large area, which will indicate to us that they preferred not to eat the bait. So our research on that is ongoing, and we'd hope to be able to answer you better in a year or two's time. I hope that answers that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sue. And I've realized that I didn't actually introduce Sue and Keith properly, but Anton mentioned them in his presentation. So Keith is the operations manager and Sue is the assistant project manager for Mouse-Free Marion project. So yeah, thanks to both of you for being available to help answer some questions. We certainly would not have been able to get through all of them verbally tonight. We would be here, yeah, we'd be here all night. So thank you very much to both of you for helping to answer those questions. I see there's just a message in the chat saying that the SnapScan link isn't working. Yeah, sorry to hear that, Karen. I did just pop the bank details in the chat. You'll just have to scroll up. Otherwise, you can go to mousefreemarion.org and you'll find all the details on there. And yeah, please do go and visit the website to learn more about the project and to see how you can donate. So I think we're going to leave it there for this evening. Thanks very much, Anton, for sticking around and making a plan with your internet. It was great to be able to have the rest of your presentation. And I know everyone, all the viewers have really enjoyed this. So thank you very much. And as I said, if anyone would like me to email you the Q&A or the answers in case you haven't got to read them all, please do send me an email at conversations@birdlife.org.za and I can send you the transcript of the Q&A of the questions. Yeah, so Anton, I don't know if you have any last words, or Keith or Sue. Otherwise, we can close off.
Well, just to say thank you very much, Christina, for the opportunity to provide an update, and to everybody who's listening, many of whom I know have already generously supported the project, and I hope will continue to do so in many ways. So thank you very much, and we look forward to keeping you posted. Yeah, we'll definitely have you back on a webinar sometime soon when you have some more to update us on. And yeah, two other things I wanted to say quickly that I've just remembered is, of course, we are planning our Flock to Marion voyage, which is happening next year in January, and it's a fundraiser for both BirdLife South Africa and the Mouse-Free Marion project. So please do visit the BirdLife South Africa website to find out more about that very exciting trip and book your spot now. And you'll be helping to support BirdLife and Mouse-Free Marion project, and get to see some of the amazing seabirds that Anton has featured in his presentation. And then the second thing was that it is World Albatross Day coming up on the 19th of June, and that's partly why we've held this webinar now in June. So please do keep an eye out on the 19th for a celebration of albatrosses, these amazing birds that we are trying to save on Marion, amongst others. So I think I will stop waffling and leave it there. Thank you very much to Anton for your amazing presentation, and thanks again to Keith and Sue for answering all those questions. And we will see you again in 2 weeks' time for another Conservation Conversations. Thanks very much and good night.